Over her 11 years, the gap between the richest 10% and the poorest 10% in this country has widened substantially.
That's right.
How can she say at the end of her chapter of British politics that she can justify many people in a constituency such as mine being relatively much poorer off, much less well housed, and much less well provided than it was in 1979? Surely she accepts that is not a record that she or any Prime Minister can be proud of.
Mr. Speaker, all levels of income are better off than they were in 1979. But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And what a policy! Yes, he would rather have the poor poorer, provided the rich were less rich.
If, God forbid, any terrorist act happens in this country, believe you me, people are not going to be asking whether this legislation is too draconian, whether it's too great an incursion into people's civil liberties. No one's going to be saying that to me. They're going to be saying, are you sure it was tough enough?
We have grown up to accept and believe that the government are working for the common good of their people. However, it doesn't take much to realise that below this thinly veiled surface of new policies and town planning aim to improve the image of society, that perhaps not all motives and intentions are for the good of the people, but for our own government and their personal interest. Not all laws in society have to pursue this common good, nor even require consensus to pass. We only have to look at recent protests and the reaction to them to see this. It is when we feel that our freedom is being imposed upon and our lives may not be within our control that unease begins to emerge. Are we really living in a free society, or just an illusion of one filtered through policies and useless jargon that, once removed, reveals a rather more sinister view on society?
Game, set and match, one more time.
The mathematician John Nash developed game theory from strategies applied during the Cold War and applied this model to people. His theory on society and humankind suggested we live in a society that exists and survives through individuals watching and strategizing against each other, all seeking their own advantage. This created a very dark view of society and the people that live within it, as it only works if each of the players in the game are selfish and altruism becomes obsolete. If the government was to ever successfully serve the public well, they would first have to work for shared goals in society, where individual sacrifice took place for the greater good. Does this greater good remain our ultimate fantasy? As individuals, we are always naturally inclined towards our own good first, the price of freedom at the price of complete self-interest. Does this situation now mean that instead of being in control of our society, we are now paranoid of it? This condition can be said to be a result of the rapid change in our confused eco-political environment, as French philosopher Michel Foucault highlighted.
Foucault located the disciplinary society in the 18th and 19th centuries. These types of societies initiate the organisation of vast spaces of enclosure. In the disciplinary society, the individual never ceases to pass from one closed environment to another. Each has its own laws, first the family, then the school, the barracks, and finally the factory. A fixed system of control that could be easily observed and understood. Foucault didn't only highlight and analyse the specifics of this disciplinary period, but he also pointed out the transience of this model. After the destruction, both societal and physical, caused by the Second World War, the disciplinary society was displaced, mainly due to a suspicion of the institutions which were a product of it. This resulted in the government needing to morph to remain significant. Control was the name William Burroughs proposed as a term for this new system. The control society is characterised by its ultra-rapid forms of free-floating control that replace the old disciplines operating in a closed system. The factory of the old society is now being replaced by the gas of the corporation, resulting in complete dependence on the economy. The creation of this type of society can be seen as having its roots in the paranoia of the Cold War, a non-physical war that was being fought with the consequences of complete annihilation. The fear of the unseen provoked suspicion and the need to constantly monitor each other. Between the Americans and the Soviet Union, this created an equilibrium of control. The two societies became strategic and the control became numerical based on Nash's game theory. This can also be applied to the family as they use emotional actions in place of nuclear strategy. Freedom at the price of complete self-interest. This doesn't only apply to the extreme example of the Cold War, but also has more subtle reincarnations in today's society. As worrying a view of people as game theory presumes, it is the basis for our current economic system. As was already stated, society has shifted from one of discipline, the factory, to one of control, the economy. A key example of this can be seen when Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979, amidst an industry in the throes of collapse. This was apparent nowhere more so than in the London Docklands. Once the largest port in the world, it was now reduced to a largely derelict wasteland, bereft of economic base and identity. As Anna Minton points out, in 1989, as the Cold War came to an end and the political economist Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history, Canary Wharf, the emblem of Thatcher's free market revolution, was going up.
With industry in decline towards the end of the 1970s, speculative policies were implemented to try and provide a new, sustainable economy. During these times, Margaret Thatcher's policies fundamentally changed the way cities were developed, with emphasis put on extracting capital from inner city areas at all costs. Since these changes took effect, successive governments have adapted planning policy further, giving development companies more and more freedom over land acquisition, and taking control out of the hands of the local councils and communities which would be affected by them. Economic gain put before social benefits.
They did not want to move.
And I've been fighting you for 4 years now.
No attempt was made to alter the plans for development to accommodate their wishes.
All of these policy changes have been passed with political rhetoric consistently giving the outward impression of a complete gain for society. However, the effects they have had over the last 30 years clearly tell a different story.
Since the restructuring of the economy, we have seen increasing polarisation in top and bottom strata of the job market. In particular, an increase in low-end to unskilled jobs. This separation can be seen as reflected in spatial patterns throughout the city, seen as socio-economic segregation.
I know my place.
To what extent does business and economic restructuring affect the layouts and social patterns within a city? Social polarisation takes place throughout the city, grouping together people and families from varying social backgrounds and household incomes. As a result, we are limited in where we can choose to live and who we interact with. This could be seen as being a result of the job market, but could be more fundamentally linked to the economy and how it constructs our cities and towns.
In comprehension of exclusion in modern society, the boundary of the urban environment is often not crossed in current discourse. The bitter, hurtful conflict of interest that has taken place in rural British communities in the recent decades has left massive divides between the local man born to his home and his new, more affluent neighbour. The experiences of the working class man of the countryside are comparable to those of tenants in a recently gentrified area in a city, both being priced out of their communities by the affluent drive of modern development. The British village was once a place where cohesion between different groups in society could be seen working on a micro scale. The farm labourer would live opposite the gentleman in the manor house, which in turn could be a few doors away from the vicar in the rectory and the teacher in the schoolhouse. These communities have now been destroyed, the working class members of it forced out of their cottages into either the nearby council, now social housing stock, or a nearby town. When some members of society have it within their means to move from a dense urban environment to a less dense or rural environment, they often choose to do so. The effect of this can be seen in the modern British village, possibly a paranoid reaction against the modern control society, the individual trying to escape the concentration of enforcement in cities and towns.
Many middle-class developments in the USA and around the world today are adopting paranoid methods in the hope of escaping urban concentration and uncomfortable interaction in their areas. Gated communities are a common way for residents to control their streets, however such attempts can aggravate rather than eliminate these problems. Separations can create a social friction that can segregate groups of individuals. Or perhaps it can be considered that these enclosures are a product of media-conditioned paranoia, either a paranoia of crime and strangers which has manifested itself in people's built environment, made to keep residents in is as much as made to keep lawbreakers out, or could it be a result of a moral panic constructed by the media over terrorism, among other things, and then developed by the backing of Oscar Newman's defensible space by the government? We feel uncomfortable about the thought of being influenced by external forces, whether it be the sensation of a psychological repression or a direct physical intervention. Efforts made to construct territorial environments separated from external factors are developed because of many different motivations. However, all are negative states of intervention and individual responsibility of space and placing it into the hands of private surveillance, gates and electrical equipment. Nain Ellen explores psychological implications of insular behaviour, suggesting that street gangs use spray paint while homeowner associations use neighbourhood watch signs. Either way, we are talking informal militias.
Development sprawl is changing to ever more confusing manifestations across Britain. Along with gated developments, there have been other, more automated interventions used to regulate our public spaces. Surveillance tools of increasing sophistication are being deployed more than ever, causing ownership of space to become less physical. There is a seductive promise that surveillance can offer greater security over dangerous public threats. Retrospective footage has been successfully used in gathering evidence to solve crimes. However, footage alone could not help to prevent crimes, as surveillance tools view the real world as a contained object. Instead of offering direct physical interaction, it can be argued that the spread of surveillance systems has created a mechanical and impersonal system of controlling power over inhabited space. Systematic surveillance provides a constant gaze over inhabited space, allowing people to leave their collective responsibility for the safety of their environment in the hands of an inanimate system. This presence of authority acts as an autonomous crime deterrent. However, the knowledge that you are being periodically viewed by an invisible power that can trace your actions with worrying accuracy does not only act as a deterrent, but it also takes away a person's control of the space they are in. Spaces under surveillance can no longer be seen as areas of public freedom, as although they may be secure, they are under constant scrutiny of institutional order. Surveillance makes a space a container. Foucault theorized that a panopticon prison functioned as a technology of power, a design to solve the problems of natural surveillance. With the polarization of population, sprawling utopias, and an increase in surveillance techniques, today's city is beginning to act more like a laboratory of power, constantly recontaining and reshaping the population without being fixed spatially. It may be sporadic, however, there is always a pressure you are being watched, eroding confidence enough for the public to be subconsciously dependent upon a system they are not in control of.